Hi guys, thanks everyone for coming here today for this wonderful talk by Professor Danny Dorling. And please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Pan, and I am a member of the Oxford China Forum. And we are very delighted to have this chance to discuss the next crisis, which is Professor Danny Dorling's new book. With the Oxford China Forum and also with you guys. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Danny Dorling to the stage.
Thanks ever so much for coming. What I'm going to do is very quickly go through about 24 slides in 30 minutes. I'm just going to pull out things in particular that might relate to China in some ways. Here we've got a map of the world. It's shaped by the world's children about 10 years ago, but it wouldn't look that much different today. You might notice a bulge towards the west in China. That's Chongqing, so it's the largest city in the world. But if you draw it like this way, you don't have to worry about the boundaries. You can see. But the world of people looks different to the world we tend to think about. This is the book. It's actually going to be published in 2 weeks' time. It's got a teaser title, which is The Next Crisis. It does actually talk about what I think the next crisis will be, but a lot of it's about current crises. Because generally the crises we face tend to be ones we faced before. We don't actually get that many things that are completely new. The pandemic in 2019 was another pandemic. We've had them before. I'm going to show you a few things about what I've done in the past that might explain why I do this. I'm a geographer. I like numbers and data. I did a book about slowdown about 4 or 5 years ago. That wasn't going to be the original title of the book. The book was going to be about what is accelerating, what is slowing down, how are things changing in the world. The surprise for me was measuring as many things as I could and finding that almost everything was slowing down, apart from emissions. Here's carbon emissions, which are rising but actually accelerating. Temperature, which you can feel today. I'm very grateful you've turned up. Yeah, it's getting hotter, and not just getting hotter, but the actual rises in temperature in the world are accelerating slightly, so you should be worried. Flights, that's the third of the things which are accelerating. Went down 2020, 2021, we know why, but as yet they're probably going to bounce back up as high, although international trade wars are brilliant for slowing down flights. I think China's just sent a whole set of Boeing planes back to the United States, but just being purchased but hopefully not paid for. And the fourth of the things that are still accelerating, which is relevant here, are the number of university students in the world. And it's easy to see that that's going to stop accelerating. You obviously can't get, well, you could get 100%. We're currently about 30% of young people going to university, but it's rising. I do weird things like take a graph like the one you just seen. This is exactly the same data, but look in detail at the changes. So here you're seeing the emissions on the vertical scale. Time is like throughout the graph, and the horizontal scale is emphasizing when emissions went up the most, when they didn't go up as much. And because it leans towards me, that's acceleration. You can see the points where we had various summits to try to agree to do something about it, and how, at least in the last 3 big summits, afterwards the emissions actually rose. Emissions tend to rise faster when there are economic booms in the world. Recessions are very good for slowing down emissions. Inequality and population are the two big things I study. You're going to get quite a bit on inequality soon. Population's really interesting for slowing down. This is the same kind of graph as I just showed you for emissions, for global population. Data from about 3 UN projections ago, heading towards 10.5 billion. The last 3 projections have all brought it down. We're heading to maybe just over 10 billion people, we think, by the year 2084. It's probably going to be earlier that we peak. I've drawn graphs of this for China. China's well ahead of the world on population slowing down, and was before the one-child policy. In that, the number of children per woman in China dropped from 6 to 2 in a generation before the one-child policy. But India is also remarkably quick on population going down. Everywhere women are having fewer children in the world, everywhere. And fewer than are projected by the demographers who keep on making the projections. Right? And that's quite interesting. I'm throwing too many graphs at you, but at least you won't get bored, you may get confused. Exactly the same graph, exactly the same data, log scales. What I'm trying to show is if you simply look at the same information in different ways, you can see very different things. And that's really a lot of what academics do. We tend to fancy it up by using long words and talking about our methodology and so on, but I don't do that. But if you look at things in different ways, you get a completely different messages. And then the question is, what is the best way to look? This is world population rising, again, on the vertical scale, but I've just put a log scale on the bottom. And it's a nice summary of what goes on in the world, or what has. Really only 3 important things. 1492, 3 little boats, several 100,000 germs, and a couple of dozen sailors, right? And you get that first dip in the Americas. Secondly, imperialism. Not just the invasion, in the case of Britain, of 90% of the current members of the United Nations, the destroying of stable social systems around the world. If you want an example, a colleague just there saying she did her university education in Australia. If you want an example of destroying a stable social system, when we turned up in Australia, that's what we did, but we also did it along the coast of Africa, and it's absolutely stunning. When you first destroy stable social systems, population goes down, but because you've destroyed the way in which the society keeps itself stable, it then explodes. So if you're wondering why the world went from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6, 7, 8 billion people so fast, that was largely due to us Europeans fucking the rest of the world up. Huge example, even though not a colony, is China. And the 100 years of shame and the opium and all the things we do not teach our children that we did. The debates about free trade in the House of Commons. That's your second one. The third one is brilliant because it's voluntary. It's led by women. It's about emancipation. And it'll be the first time in the history of our species that, for sure, the population of human beings will stop rising on the planet. That's where we are getting more and more dead cert on heading, bar a global catastrophe, a third world war, something else that disturbs the direction in which we're going. More introduction of what I do. Why did I write a book on world crises? Because I got too depressed writing about the UK. I wrote about the UK because what I first studied in the 1980s was the UK, and I drew lots and lots of maps of census data, and then I measured change from 71 to 81 to 1991 to 2001. And all the time inequalities were rising. The last book that I'll probably write for some time is called Shattered Nation. That graph is the income inequality graph for the UK. It's quite remarkable how simple the graph is. The top line is the richest 1% of the 1%, what their income is. In 1910, the richest 1 in 10,000 people had an average income 400 times the mean, 400 times the mean, which meant you could employ 200 servants at about half average wages and still have an enormous amount of money. And if you can employ 200 servants, you can have an enormous country house and so on. It's a log scale on the vertical axis because the increase in inequality was so utterly dramatic in the UK. And then, late 1970s, we have a kind of cultural revolution. I'm going to stop trying to do the, but really absolute massive change in thinking in Britain, and inequality rises again. It's currently maybe at a peak. It's faltering, and the peak is around about 1930s level, not as bad as it was. Most complicated graph you're going to see is trying to explain why the UK is so strange. This is IMF data on public spending as a proportion of GDP, which is very similar to taxation as a proportion of GDP, give or take borrowing. UK is the red line at the bottom. Low tax, low spend economy. The two I've missed out are Ireland and Switzerland because they're weird economies in terms of GDP, because of American companies in Dublin, and because of pharmaceutical companies in Switzerland. So they look like they're low public spending, but that's only because their GDP is elevated. So I'm being academic and trying to say I'm not fixing it. You exclude those, and this state, UK, is just remarkable. We spend the less per head on our schools for the 93% who go to government schools. We spend remarkably less than, say, Germany on healthcare, about £1 billion less a week, euros, pounds. We spend less on elderly care. We spend less state funding on universities. This is a private institution. I think it's in the national accounts as a private institution or a charity. Government money for universities is very, very low. We do have taxation at a 70-year high. The red line ends up higher than the beginning because of ageing and other costs that go up, but it's still very low. The two peaks, by the way, are the 2008 banking crisis, when every country had to spend public money, or they could have done it differently, and they did do it differently. We spent a lot. And then the nearer peak is COVID-19, right? So that's when people do the same. But you're looking at entire health service differences, a couple of national health services. Okay. When Rachel Reeves says it isn't possible, right, she's just ignoring Europe. And she may not know, because I don't think when she did PPE at St John's, she was actually taught about European countries. I assume not. I don't know yet whether the PPE course actually teaches our students about economics and politics in other European countries at a level to understand a graph as simple as this. Maybe some of you may be doing it, let alone outside of Europe. This is context for you about the situation, and it's interesting. Again, contrast this with China. I was in China in January, people were a bit upset, the growth rate had only dropped to 6%. The upper middle class university academics and students who I'm with were a bit worried that the boom might be ending. Not that they were going to lose jobs, but the kind of roller coaster expansion might be slowing down. In the memory of young people in China, there is no memory of a time in which there wasn't growth. The difference here, where you have celebrity economic figures trying to explain that the poorest fifth of people in the UK are poorest than the average poorest fifth in Eastern Europe, and this has got through. Most people in the UK are aware that things are very, very bad now. We used to have an argument all the way through to 2015, 2016, all the way through the Blair years, of don't worry, things are getting much better, the government's doing very well. Wasn't true, never was, but you can see politicians really believing it. The peak of that was 2015 and George Osborne, the Chancellor then, saying that if we only follow his economic plan, by the year 2030, I'm going to have a party about this, by the year 2030 the UK will be the highest per capita income country of any sizable population on the planet. And I think George Osborne actually believed it. I think he actually believed that his plan, and also that this was really necessary. You know, that your goal should be to be the richest country on earth again, something destined for the British to do. I'll skip over that and get onto almost the book. The last book I do too many books, but my colleague is sitting in the audience who made it. Books are much more gratifying than papers if you can get them out, because they actually come out. They tend not to get rejected. They can, but as long as you work hard enough, they don't. And people read them, which is why I do books. 7 Children is about 7 typical children in the UK. I would love to try to do this exercise, or work for people to do this exercise for other countries. There were 8 bars there. That was the publisher's decision. One problem about working with publishers is that they control the title and the cover of a book, and the publisher decided that 8 looked better, even though the book's about 7 children. If you ignore the bar nearest to me, those are the average disposable income of 7 typical children. If you line up all 14 million children who were alive in 2018, sort them by their income of their families, so you've got 7 groups of 2 million, and take the middle child. So when we say things, let's skip forward again, that the UK is now the economically most unequal country in Europe, we'll take Bulgaria, you often don't realise what that means. Here's those 7 typical children and the incomes of their families. To spoil the book for you, you may not see the grey lines. The grey lines are percentiles of children. The top 2 are cut off by the graph. The top 2%, you're looking at a disposable income after tax and after housing of about 120,000 a year. That's not what you're paid, that's after the tax. So you might be paid 200 grand. As a family, top 1%, you're looking at over 600,000. So that top line would have to go all the way towards the back of the lecture theatre. Our child number 1, the rich kid, typical of the richest 2 million out of 14 million, mum and dad run a corner shop. Right, really unequal country means, back to the 1930s, inequality means this. Why don't you see it? Because you're in the middle of Oxford. And you probably are not from the 3rd of Oxford, which has the poverty range above average for England. You don't see most towns in England. We are segregated, really segregated, so you don't see. The children of Oxford don't see, because we have enormous educational segregation in this city. Unbelievable, off the scale of the European level. Not just between the 1/3 who go private at 15 and the 2/3 who go state, but between the 6 large state schools, there were walls that are £100,000 high in terms of house prices. Tiny city. You can cycle from North Oxford safely to Cowley Centre in about 27 minutes without being an annoying, far too heavy man on a bike. You know, it's quite incredible. Crises, that medline is the current cost of living crisis. We almost got out of it until inflation rose at the end of the pandemic. We almost got back to 2008 levels for the median family, but not quite. So that one's going on. And this is the inequality change in the UK. I was born in '68. As a child in the city, I grew up in a country which was very similar to Sweden in terms of inequality. And I can talk to you about the differences between schools and the feeling and how it was different. There were 40,000 car workers. They were well paid, mainly men, some women. It was very unequal by men and women. It was very, very racist in Oxford. But the class differences had never been lower, and the university was scared, in the late 70s, early 80s. That rise is our kind of cultural revolution. That's Margaret Thatcher, changing an ethos. The fact that those lines are almost flat shows you the failures of what happened after 1997. Really high inequality, hardly dented, it's basically random. And last of all, before we get on to crises, it's related. These are the inequality trends for a series of European countries. They're sloping down. Inequalities are falling in most countries of the world. They may be falling here now. they're rising in China. They're falling worldwide due to China, increasing, putting people up in the world. If you ignore the richest 50 billionaires and the bottom half billion of the world, things are actually getting more equal and dramatically better in terms of quality of life and health and so on. There's lots of good news. This is a lovely good news graph, the last one before I get on to crises. This is the United Nations' latest estimates of change in child poverty for every country they report, and all these going down are falls, big falls, 13-20% falls in child poverty in just 7 years. Really brilliant. I might do a book on just really good news at some point, because it certainly makes you happy to do it, but it's incredibly good news. Right? Unbelievable. If you've got really good eyesight, you'll see the countries that are failing at the top, and right at the top is United Kingdom, and we had one of the highest rates of child poverty in Europe, and then we've had the biggest increase. So it's all a bit shameful, and I got sick of writing about the UK at this point. Crises, things that people worry about, what we should worry about. It's obviously influenced by starting to write it during a pandemic. My attitude to the pandemic maybe have been a bit too gung-ho. The first data I ever looked at was mortality data. I've looked at death data all my life. I come from a medic family where the idea of people dying is not completely shocking to me. When the pandemic happened, for a lot of people, there was a fear of death. But I can remember when the pandemic started thinking, why on earth are we getting so incredibly worried? Look at the death rates on those cruise liners. You know, this really is, well, certainly for young adults, the mortality of young adults got better during the pandemic because of cars, because of fewer people being hit by cars. The pandemic was absolutely devastating if you were old, principally. We lost in the UK 15% of all our men over 90 due to COVID, and 10% of all women over 90. Incredibly affected by age. The second most important, age wipes out everything else. After age, it's sex. You're 50% more likely to die as a man of any age than women. Really interesting, we never picked that up as men have crap immune systems due to lacking a chromosome, which is one that makes them men. And then after that, there were other differences that we got really fascinated by that really don't matter in comparison. The socio-economic difference is tiny compared to just being a bit older. Does matter a bit, but not. Anyway, I got interested. That's an n-gram diagram of just use of the word crises. It's easy to do, a bit too easy to do. But what's interesting about it is, I think you're going from 1850 or so onwards, 1820. That century was just full of what we now call crises, right? Pandemics, epidemics, wars, things were falling apart all the time. This city was full of cholera. We were trying to work out what caused it. Ackland, who was a doctor, put people on top of a tower, men, who had to look out to see if there's any lightning, and without the sound of thunder, which wasn't the cause of cholera, but you can see how people were frightened. But we didn't talk about crises when crises were common. It's not until the 1960s we have a Cuban Missile Crisis, but until I think things became less crisis-ridden, when we'd actually not had a big war for some time, before Vietnam, which was worldwide, relatively small, and then crises all the time. And the graph ends in 2019, so we know when it's updated it's going to zoom off the scale, right? I collect data from other people who work really, really hard and just draw pictures of their data. Those circles are the countries of the world sized by the number of people who died due to wars since 1989. War's one of the crises. I've only got 5 minutes left, which is good. I used Ipsos Mori data mainly. Ipsos have been polling for a couple of decades, 30 countries in the world, asking what things concern people the most, and doing it every month. They ask about 18 things. The country they don't include is China, big one that really matters. Luckily, the Chinese Academy of Sciences runs a survey about what people worry about. Okay, not for quite as long, but still really useful. And the biggest worry in China is healthcare, by the way, access to healthcare, which I suspect is a mixture of, we've got a lot of elderly relatives, but also, if you're trying to get an operation, do you need a little bit of money, would it help? I'll speak too fast, but China is more unequal than, in terms of income, than the UK, slightly more. About the same as USA. Access to healthcare in unequal countries doesn't tend to be equitable. But also, why is healthcare the biggest worry in China? Because the other worries are much less of a worry. The worries about getting by, when you almost all get by so much better than your grandparents and your parents, and you have a government that has to ensure you will get by, because they're very afraid of not being a government anymore. Well, be careful. In a democracy, you can be thrown out of office, you get another job, you go and work for the finance industry, you double your salary, you're back again 4 years later. When there isn't a democracy, the way in which you lose power is much more frightening. So the incentive to do well by your population is bigger. I won't do any more controversial arguments, but the biggest worries in the world, and I've collected some together, although my collection doesn't really matter too much. The two biggest, which I've combined as one, are cost of living, inflation and poverty, and inequality. Until the cost of living crisis, inequality and poverty was the biggest concern. These are similar things. We're worrying about inflation because we're worrying about having enough money. It's called 2 because it's chapter 2 in the book. So getting by is the biggest worry in the world. And this is the worry of the world's middle class, the kind of people who fill in surveys. Half the world doesn't fill in these surveys. And that half of the world is just trying to get to the end of the day, and then to the next day. Right? So this is a middle class worry in the UK as well. Right? Inequality, cost of living, poverty. The second is unemployment. Are you going to be needed? And again, this is a middle class fear. It isn't a fear in this university, right? Because it's one of the few universities which are safe, we think. So we've only got to look at Harvard, if you know what's just happened at Harvard, to know, it's possible to be really safe and then suddenly find out you're not really safe. Chapter 4, the third worry is crime, violence, I've included war. Then, cradle to grave issues, healthcare, education and so on. Real concern of people, like the top concern in China. And only then do you get climate crisis. And it's falling. And people who study climate know it's falling. And it's lethargy, heard it too often, crying wolf, slow, distant in time, distant in space often. And then I put in, because I work in the geography department, but also it's there. And you could well argue the biggest crisis actually isn't climate. If you step back, it's actually the extinction of species and things we're never going to get back again. But that really is at the bottom of the concerns of people. Now, I'm not going to say much about cost of living crisis, other than some economists claim that we've seen a dramatic fall in poverty. So I won't say much about that. They're essentially wrong, but the fall we've seen, which is in people with extremely small amounts of money, is largely due to the population change I showed you at the beginning. The deceleration of population after 1968, fewer children have been born into absolute poverty. It's not that capitalism has done really, really well, it's that women have done really well getting power of their bodies and saying they don't want another child. Right? Completely different to what the male-dominated economic profession tends to think. Sharing of work, just look at the quote, you don't have to look at the graphs about the UK. Number of emails I've received from colleagues around the world of my age. I'm 57. I'm expensive. If I was in a normal university, my head of department would be having a little chat with me and going, Danny, these books are quite nice and so on, and I know we can get you to go another couple of lecture courses, but there's no way our budget isn't going to drop by 10 or 15% in real terms next year, and you've had a good shot, time to go. Yeah, it really would. And that's a quote from somebody just a couple of years younger than me, not at a university like this. Which, unless you can, I don't think I have to convince you about the fear of unemployment amongst relatively well-off people. And for young people, the fear is will I get that job? And in a country like the UK, where the top 10% take 40% of all income, it's will I get that job that will put me in the top 10%? And if you're in the top 1 or 2%, you have very little freedom. You know, it really has to be law, finance, a few other things. You can't do other things. In a more equal country, you can. War's interesting. I could do an optimistic thing on war, which is we are getting better and better at seeing war as not excusable. So if you look at that map of war and think of all the countries that are not there anymore, you can also look at who do we think it's okay to kill. Most of the weapons that have killed these people are made in rich countries, but it's changing. I've only got about 2 or 3 minutes, which is why and the book's full of graphs. Okay. Cradle to grave issues. Now this is interesting because it's the biggest concern in China. It's a low concern in the United States, but this graph here, it's from the Atlantic, the far one, is how much more likely you are to die each year depending on your age if you're in the USA as compared to in other affluent countries. And it's staggering. It's like there's a war going on. You know, by your 30s, you're 4 times more likely to die in a year. It's fentanyl, it's guns. Most of the gun deaths in the USA, by the way, are people using their own gun on themselves. If you flood the country with guns, that's what happens. Enormous number of road deaths, depression. You know, it is staggering. This is a graph from the Financial Times about looking at percentiles of people. The richest 1% are Americans. They're really, really very well off. But they don't live even a month longer than the richest 1% of people in England. And we have one of the worst health records now in Western Europe. Yeah, it's staggering how badly the USA does, but it's not seen as an issue. I do a bit of looking at conspiracy theories because I find it entertaining, and also what people worry about, and of course conspiracy theories is one. So I'll show you two graphs. The first here is how many people believe that a single secretive group ruled the world. This is YouGov trying to work out, obviously trying to work out anti-Semitism and Illuminati. At the bottom you've got Japan, Denmark, Sweden, UK. We don't tick that. At the top, Nigeria, South Africa, Mexico, Turkey. This question isn't asked by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, as far as I remember. But you've got to think about this. You know, we're not ruled by lizard people with tails and so on. But yeah, the people who actually do make most decisions in the world don't really meet in public and put the mic on and live stream. You know, Tony Blair and George Bush didn't invite everybody else to watch them chatting about whether to start a war or not. What I liked about the YouGov survey was that one of the conspiracy theories they tested turned out to be true by the time they got the results in. This was Russian interference in the first Trump election, which they were testing as a conspiracy theory. Here's the second one. We can make ourselves feel good, by the way, in the UK on this. This is people who believe that climate change is a hoax. It's a lot of effort to get into the best place in the world. Right? And also for a country which doesn't tend to be good at that many things, we are good at some things. But we are the least climate skeptic place in the world. Mixture of our politicians agreeing still, give or take Nigel and a bit of Kemi, but still agreeing we're not going to argue about this. Our media, probably our academics doing a really good job with down there. Nigeria, United States, very, very big difference. Those complicated graphs are all about the incredible inequality in who emits most. It is when people get a lot of money, on average, and there are people with lots of money who are a bit more spoiled, but the average person with a lot of money spends their huge amount of money on things that emit enormous amounts of carbon. It's not just the private planes and so on, because you can only fly in one private plane at a time. It's those huge cruise liners, it's heating multiple houses. It's the emissions of the rich are staggering in that you can actually distribute that income more equally and see emissions fall despite the same amount of money being spent. Here's my last slide. So I have ended on time, I'll just leave it up. When I sort this out better for when I'm doing a talk about the book, I'm going to take these 10 things and actually have them as kind of 10 headings of slides and have far less material. I tend to have an optimistic view that we've been struggling for 200 or 300 years trying to work out how to be better and share things better. My view is very, very British-centric. This is the 10 Commandments of the Socialist Sunday School movement, which doesn't exist anymore. But just to give you an idea of the kind of things people were thinking in a poor suburb of Bradford in 1914. There's a kind of struggling through about how can we be a little bit better, how can we behave better, how to treat people. I doubt any of that looks too radical today, but of course the very idea then of having an alternative set of commandments to the religious ones, you know, that was a bit rude. The religious ones, by the way, I gave a version of this talk last night in Leeds to the Humanist Society. I didn't quite realise the advantage of talking to a Humanist Society is none of them are going to get offended by a different set of 10 commandments. Maybe I offend you, but I was made to learn the 10 commandments at school and to sing all things bright and beautiful and to colour in Jesus blue for some reason. The nice commandments are all at the beginning, that don't kill people and so on. Have a look at commandment number 9 and 10. You know, not covering your neighbour's slave and ox and wife and so on. It's pretty handmaiden's tale towards the end of the 10 Christian commandments. Anyway, I'll end with that. I do think things are getting better overall. I think the rise in position and power of women is a dramatic change, so we underestimate the implications of it. We tend to concentrate on our worst worries and fears when we worry at all. Most of our worries are personal. They literally are, how are we getting on with our family, friends, love life and so on. They're not, most people are not actually worrying about any of those 18 things most of the time. If you ask questions differently, you can get different answers. You can get half the world telling you they're really frightened of nuclear war if you just ask a question. And it's tricky. And I have great sympathy with that because I was born in 1968 and I grew up here. And we were surrounded by American cruise missile bases, and I knew how I was most likely to die, which was in that nuclear war that seemed to be almost inevitable. You know, things that seem to be almost inevitable cannot happen. But you can see I'm on an optimistic streak, and I'm particularly optimistic by the current behaviour and attitude of some of the elite in China to the provocation that's coming from the United States at the moment. I think it's really interesting, and you probably couldn't have predicted it if you'd said to somebody 5 or 10 years ago, what will be the immediate reaction to this kind of thing happening? And I think it's interesting, and perhaps Trump being a bit crass in the first period gave people enough time to think, how are we going to deal with this person so we are potentially dealing with him better than we might have otherwise done. That's just over half an hour. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. And as we planned a student panel after the presentation, so we might be ready to start. And then I also want to introduce the other two student panelists, and each one. Yeah, we are all members of the Oxford China Forum, and we are very happy today to be able to discuss the things with Danny. So please stage. And I want to thank Danny again for this wonderful presentation. And then I was thinking that we might want to start from the book. So I was wondering what made you want to write this book, and especially because I see a lot of people always try to make arguments about what crisis should we worry about, but what I see you're doing are more like trying to use graphs and data to show that what people are actually worrying about. So why do you think it is important to let people know that what other people are actually worrying about?
Yeah, I was wanting to write something optimistic, I mean, that's, so there's a bias in this from the very beginning. And I thought it's really worth taking seriously people's views. And by people, really, these surveys are of better off people. When you look at the biases, and also the countries that are involved, So if you want to argue that people don't understand, that they were ill-informed, it's quite hard. I think people's actual concerns are quite good to get a gauge about what are the current crises. And if you look back, I think you can make a case that most of our serious crises have been things that have happened recently. We don't tend to have that many which are that new. Those which are that new are incredibly hard to predict. So nuclear weapons, almost impossible to have predicted. And that short period between the realisation that it's possible to make one and one appearing. So there may be things that could happen that we can't predict, but there's nothing we can do about them. The stuff we really like worrying about, we know that asteroids and that is so unlikely compared to the ways we're able to destroy ourselves. That seems a bit silly. And I have my own biases. We're currently in the 4th AI revolution of my lifetime. And I'm sceptical. When I did my PhD in 1989, neural networks had just managed to emulate a sea slug, and my supervisor was programming them. But I'm a cynical old man who finds it hard to get necessarily scared. So if you take AI, Steve Wolfram wrote a lovely, really short 97-page book on AI that's mainly a bit scary about it. And on page 97 it says, it won't scale up very much. They aren't going to get that much better, the current ChatGPT things. But of course it could always happen. But it's like fairy tales. We have these fears, and we're a species designed to be afraid. Our eyes are kind of set back in case that wolf comes to get us, and it's really good we worry, because that's how we stop things getting really bad. But given what damages the health of most people most of the time, if you want to, one definition of crisis is, how many years of life does it take off people? These big ones are by far the most important things for affecting health.
Well, I want to draw on one of the trends that you have observed in the 1940s, I think, that there has been this significant rise in terms of people using the use of word crisis in English. To what extent, what are the reasons behind this dramatic change in the sensitivity of people regarding how terrible our era is? Is that sudden change of the terribleness of the era, or are there other factors accounting for this change? Why are we a bit more scared after that era of 1940s?
Why did it increase? These are the words used in publications. So they're words used by only 1 in 3,000 people in the world gets to write a book. So these are words being used by pretty well-off people. They're partly used to sell copy, get people interested, be current. But that period after the 40s, it only just begins to rise then. After the Second World War, there was a period amongst young people of great optimism. We're not going to do this again, we're going to make sure we're going to do this again. Our leaders in Europe had taken us to war twice in lifetimes, so there was a scepticism about the elite, which is partly why you got lots of political changes occurring. And I think it's the punctuation of this idea of comfort, and we've got well-planned economies, we've got better education, our children will drop into good jobs. And then the idea that that might not happen is seen as a crisis. Whereas going back to earlier periods of history, the idea that your city-state might not be overrun by somebody from another city-state within a 50-year period was pretty unlikely.
So in some way, it's like we are overreacting to what is in place. We're a bit oversensitive.
I think we're overacting in many ways. For instance, people talk about, and people just don't check numbers. So they talk about the number of pandemics is accelerating without just looking. right? The number of pandemics every decade, if you take the WHO defined ones, they're going down. Have been going down for a long time. It's really interesting to ask why, when we've got more human beings clustered together, why aren't we getting more new diseases jumping to humans? The biggest flu was 1918. There's probably one that nobody's quite sure what the year of the next one was. We only know how to identify a flu virus in 1936. We had a pandemic in 1957, in 1968, 69, and 1977. And then they became so small they weren't even really noticed. If you remember the swine flu one? Yeah. But yeah, and we're constantly worrying about bird flu. You know, it could happen. There are whole worry industries. So there was a huge flu industry, you know, which is all about preparing for creating the vaccines against flu, trying to prevent 1918 again. And it's, you know, I work in an academic industry about inequality. I just happen to think I can show you that inequality really matters. But one of the rises of scientists in universities now is advocacy for your particular thing. So there became a point when the Centre for Disease Control got so sick of people claiming that these various diseases were killing so many people, because you could add them all up. And if you added up how many people that the heart disease charity said died of heart disease, and how many people, and the problem is it adds up to far more than the number of people dying. So CDC did a wonderful thing of actually saying, we are going to try to say how many people die of each cause. And I think we need a bit more of that. Otherwise, you get this enormous pessimism. You know, the world's going to end in 12 years. The pessimism you find, which is highest amongst the best educated young people in Europe, that everything's going to go wrong in the future for us, which doesn't seem to be quite rational. That group's probably going to be okay. They could be much better okay if their mental health was better, if their countries were more equitable. And yes, if we acted on climate change better than we are, then there's every. But we should celebrate if we do that, rather than say it's never enough. But those are my kind of concerns.
I just wanted to ask a question, follow up on Rachel's question, but from a different angle. So you've mentioned that in the 20th century there's been a number of different crises, and in your book you mentioned the crises that we face today. So I was just wondering, do you think there's any fundamental differences between the crises that we face today and the crises we faced in the past, in terms of the influence and possible solutions and so on?
One thing is the interconnection. So I did a paper with a PhD student in geography recently, where we looked at 400 years of house price data for those world cities you could get, bits of a 400-year series, to see when do house prices rise they only ever get to 3 or 3.5 times the average, because they can't go higher, people can't buy them anymore. And the interesting thing was that the kind of house price booms and busts aren't any bigger or smaller now than the biggest ones we've seen before. We're in a kind of boom now, but they're now synchronized worldwide. So things happen together. So there is much more interconnection than there was. And that's the biggest. If there's a crisis in one part of the world, it tends to affect other parts.
On that specifically, I think one interesting observation about this kind of worry is that it's a very blind, overarching worry about this era is terrible. It's not a specific worry on, let's say, just inflation specifically. I want to raise this, cultural concerns. I think recently we've seen quite a lot of people worrying about, for example, the discussion of DEI, where a lot of the Republicans are attacking the ideas of DEI, and the recent Supreme Court ruling on transgender people in the UK. I think, when my friend in the US told me that when Trump was elected, many of the universities actually had a day off for their mental health, to offer like mental counseling for the students. I think that could also be a reinforcing factor. How do you view, the rise of populism, the rise of maybe the decline of liberalism and a threat towards this kind of values that we hold? Is that a legitimate concern, or is that also part of the overreaction that you're
Okay, two things. One, on the rise of populism, the New York Times used to do a brilliant annual story where they'll produce graphs for every country in Europe of the size of the far right vote. It depends which political party you call as far right. And they coloured the far right in red, so it looked very scary, because in the US, red means right. What the graph showed over time is that the far right fell as much as they rose. I mean, they have to, otherwise we'd be a completely fascist continent by now. And we never talk about the falls. We don't talk about Golden Dawns essentially going from Greece, about what happened in the last election in Poland. It's not newsworthy, the fall. So you can worry about India, which is the biggest one, which matters the most in Modi, although his last election was surprisingly bad for him. And you can worry about Hungary, and you can worry about the USA, and you can worry about Turkey. But look at Brazil; it goes the other way. So I think if you add it up overall, I'm sceptical that we are actually seeing, but it ends up being an argument about where are these political parties. I call the Conservative Party of this country a far right party, because in 2014 they left the European bloc of Conservative parties and joined an alliance with Alternative for Deutschland. So I think we have a far right Conservative Party and a far right Reform, and we should be really scared. If it's going to happen anywhere in Europe, it's going to happen here. That's where the money's going to come. So there are things you should really worry about. And I worry that we don't worry about the things we should really worry about because we worry about so many others. As Sharka has got this brilliant book that's coming out. I forgot its title, it's about wokeism, and she's Novara Media, and it'll cause arguments and upset. But essentially it's about what's called dead cats, which you may, if you want to stop a discussion that's going on, you throw a dead cat on the table, and everybody talks about dead cats. And hence, if you look at trans in the Scottish Parliament, it's been devastating. And there are people who are playing you to try to get you to argue about things being the most important. My subject, we were on 495 UK academic geographers as of an hour ago have signed a letter wanting the Royal Geographical Society to show solidarity with something about the Supreme Court judgment. 495 academic geographers. I mean, I didn't know we had that many. And I've got sympathy for this, right? There's many more times than other academic geographers who were willing to sign a letter about the RGS's position over Palestine. The Royal Geographical Society kicked the Palestinian Society out of the building. That's fairly racist, but not as important as this issue. And I do think we need to step back and order things by health implications. So the reason why trans really matters is suicides of young trans people, and that's why it really matters. But you put it in the context of the total number of people you're dealing with, it's a really important issue for a relatively small number of people. We have rising mortality of babies in this country, for all babies on average. Now that should really matter. The fact that so much less of an issue is because of the dead cat. So order them in order. Don't ignore something that really matters to a small group. It matters for them, but don't let it become the most important political thing, because the far right can work out. If we can get you to talk about this, we can win votes by saying all the left do is to talk about this.
So you mentioned about inequality, segregation in education and in other aspects of life. Would you say that this culture of information channels and also depiction of crisis contributes partly to people's biased understanding of crisis? And if that's so, how do we tackle this? How do we truly see crisis? Because your book would be very helpful in helping people to understand, but I think people normally will receive information from news channels and instead of this mass polling data. So how do we as individuals adapt to this?
One thing I've noticed, and you always notice when things happen just before your book's published, so you can absolutely say it had nothing to do with your book. One, Tony Jupiter's just had a book out about the environment. There's been another 2 or 3 all linking economic inequality and the environment, all very, very recently. But I think this is incredibly useful, that they may partly be doing it because these people are most concerned about the environment and have all their lives, because they've got worried about people becoming less interested in the environment, so you link their main concern, which is getting by, to the environment. But that's the kind of thing I think is useful to do. Is if somebody's really interested in, take an issue like trans. You know, if you're really interested, that's the key thing that really burns you up. Have a look at the intersection between trans and other things such as social class, and see which people are most likely to kill themselves, and I bet you it'll be working class trans people. And if you find that is the case, it might increase the sympathy of people who might otherwise not be sympathetic. If you look at racism, you're more affected by racism if you have less money. You can insulate yourself less from it than if you have more money. And by looking at those things which are trendy, I hate the word intersectionality because I did a stats degree, and so it's, we had methods for looking at these things in the 1960s. But anyway, it's just a way of getting solidarity across causes and putting things into a kind of order of priority of what are you going to do most and what are you going to do first. And if you don't put them in that order, you can end up with the Democrats